Kind of a general history brief about the unknowns and where the tomb started, and then we'll jump into kind of a more Q&A type of format, okay? So after the First World War, which we fought from 1917 to 1918, the United States, mirroring some of our allies like England and France, decided to have an unknown interred here in Arlington from the First World War. So Congress passed a public resolution in 1921, and they went over to France and they exhumed 4 unknown Americans from 4 of the 8 American cemeteries from the First World War in France. So when they exhumed those bodies, they were placed in the unknown graves. They selected the graves and then exhumed the bodies. They placed all 4 of those remains in identical caskets, and they draped American flags over each of the caskets, so they were completely unidentifiable. So nobody knew which set of remains came from what cemetery. So they're completely unknown. Once that was complete, they escorted those caskets to a town in France called Chalon-sur-Marne, and in Chalon-sur-Marne was where the final selection for the World War I unknown took place. So a gentleman by the name of Sergeant Edward Younger was selected to make the final selection for the World War I unknown. If you look underneath that window right there, you'll see a wooden picture frame. Inside of that wooden picture frame, you'll see a picture of a gentleman in uniform. That is a picture of Sergeant Younger. And right behind that photograph are his original orders from 1921, detailing him to go and make that selection. So if you're familiar with military orders, which all of you should be, you'll know that the orders that are cut right there almost look identical to the orders that we have now. Just those were on a typewriter instead of printed out. So Sergeant Younger, he walked into the foyer of the town hall in Chalon-sur-Marne where the 4 caskets were. And again, they were completely unidentifiable. And he circled those 4 caskets 3 times. He placed a bouquet of white roses on the 3rd casket from the left, which officially selected the 3rd casket as the World War I unknown. The other 3 caskets that were not selected were reinterred back into the cemeteries in France. So we now have the World War I unknown selected. He was then escorted to a port on the west coast of France called Port Le Havre. When he arrived in Port Le Havre, he was onboarded to a ship called the USS Olympia. The USS Olympia carried the unknown soldier from France to the Naval Yard here in DC. When the unknown arrived at the Naval Yard, he was then escorted to the Capitol, where he lied in state for 2 days. And again, very similar to like state funerals, he was lying in state in that Capitol rotunda. And then on Armistice Day of 1921, he was escorted above our heads to the amphitheater where his actual funeral was held. Armistice Day, 11 November 1921, marked the 3rd anniversary of the conclusion of the First World War. 11 November was the day that World War I ended in 1918. We now know November 11th as Veterans Day. So Veterans Day traces its roots back to the end of the First World War. So the president at the time, President Warren G. Harding, resided over the funeral here in the amphitheater. And traditionally, at the conclusion of military funerals, the family receives a folder flag on behalf of the deceased soldier. And since the unknown didn't have a family, obviously, because nobody knew who it was, the president decided to stand in as that symbolic next of kin for the unknown. So he received the folder flag at the conclusion of the funeral. And after the funeral, he was then escorted onto the plaza, the same pathway right on the other side of this window where the guards now walk back and forth to start and end the guard change ceremony. The unknown was carried right down that path. So every time we're walking back and forth to go change the guard, we're walking in the same footsteps that the unknown was carried from World War I. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. We know, of course, that was not the case. So in 1941, we got involved in the Second World War. We fought that war until 1945. At the conclusion of the Second World War in 1945, there was another public resolution passed through Congress to authorize an unknown from World War II to be interred here in Arlington. Now, due to the large-scale, I'm going to use a buzzword here, the large-scale combat operations of the Second World War, the fact that we fought in multiple theaters, and the amount of unknown casualties that were sustained from that global conflict, the selection process looked a lot different than just selecting 4 unknowns. So they ended up with the number of 19 towards the end, and through selecting those 19, They chose 13 from the Atlantic Theater, so Europe, and they chose 6 from the Pacific Theater, basically all the islands and in and around the Pacific. So for a total of 19, the 6 that were selected to be the Pacific unknowns, one of those was selected, and he was selected by Colonel Glenn T. Eagleston. Basically the same exact ceremony occurred where they were all placed in identical caskets. Colonel Eagleston circled those caskets, and he placed a white wreath at one of the caskets, which officially selected the Pacific Theater unknown. Very similarly, of the 13 that were from the Atlantic Theater, they were all placed in identical caskets, and Lieutenant General Edward J. O'Neill made the final selection. So we now have 2 unknowns from World War II. We have 1 from the Pacific and 1 from the Atlantic Theater, okay? Now, I mentioned that there was a huge difficulty in disinterring these unknown soldiers for a total of 19 of them. The selection process took a lot longer than just randomly selecting 4 unknown soldiers from the war. So it took so long, in fact, that they weren't officially selected until after the Korean War. So they were still selecting those unknowns and sifting through each set of remains to ensure that they were unknown. By the time the Korean War rolled around in 1951, they still hadn't made those 2 selections. So they paused the selection process and then began to fight the Korean War. We fought in the Korean War until 1953, and at the conclusion of the Korean War in 1953, Congress again passed a public resolution authorizing there to be an unknown interred in Arlington from the Korean War, and they resumed the selection process for those World War II unknowns. So very shortly after the Korean War, the World War II unknowns were selected, and very similarly, the Korean War unknown was selected. So for the Korean War, there was 4 sets of unknown remains, again placed in 4 identical caskets, and they were selected by a gentleman named Master Sergeant Ned Lyle, who fought in the Korean War. He circled 4 of those caskets, and he placed a blue and white wreath at one of the caskets, which officially selected that Korean War unknown. The 3 who were not selected, as well as the other 17 from the World War II selection process, they were all reinterred back in the cemeteries. So now we had 3 unknowns. We had the World War II unknown from the Pacific, World War II unknown from the Atlantic, and then the Korean War unknown. Those 3 unknowns were all brought about 33 miles offshore from the Norfolk Navy base to a ship called the USS Canberra, and it was on board the USS Canberra that the final selection for World War II was made. So they allowed Hospital Corpsman First Class William R. Charette to select the World War II unknowns. He was the Navy's only Medal of Honor recipient to survive the Korean War. And they decided to allow him to make that selection because, again, he was the only surviving one who was still on active duty. Now, this also marked the first time that an unknown was selected by somebody who didn't fight in the same war as them. So we had a Korean War guy selecting World War II unknowns. So he circled those 2 caskets, World War II Pacific, World War II Atlantic, a couple times, and he decided to place a wreath at one of the 2. Nobody knows which one because, again, they were in identical caskets and they were switched around, so nobody knew which was Atlantic and which was Pacific. So he made the final selection for the World War II unknown, and then the unknown from World War II who was not selected was given a naval funeral at sea, and he was buried 33 miles offshore, off the Canberra. So now we had the World War II unknown and the Korean War unknown. Those 2 unknowns were brought to the Naval Yard here in DC, and they were both escorted to the Capitol to lie in state. So they lied in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and then on Memorial Day of 1958, they were escorted above our heads here to the amphitheater where their funeral was conducted. The president at the time, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, stood in as a symbolic next of kin for World War II unknown, and Vice President Richard Nixon stood in as a symbolic next of kin for the Korean War unknown. And following that ceremony and their funeral, they were interred here in the plaza. We as Tomb Guards, we call that our double interment because there was 2 unknowns that were placed in the plaza here. If you're a student of history or are interested in history at all, you'll know that there's a lot of coincidence and a lot of dates that kind of line up. When this happened in 1958 was also the year we began sending troops to be advisors in Vietnam. So that officially kicked off the Vietnam conflict in 1958. We fought in Vietnam until 1975, and at the conclusion of the Vietnam War in 1975, there was only 1 unknown from the entire war. So in 1972, a team was moving through the jungles of Vietnam and they discovered a crashed aircraft. When they approached the aircraft, they found a set of remains in the cockpit, but they were unable to identify who it was. The aircraft didn't have any identifying features. They weren't able to identify any tail markings, really anything on the aircraft. They weren't able to identify who the pilot was. So they escorted his remains in 1972 to a central laboratory in Pearl Harbor. Now, at this laboratory in Pearl Harbor, they continued to try to identify who this soldier was from Vietnam, but they were not able to, just due to the fact that DNA was not advanced enough to try to identify who this was. So they kept trying to identify who this person was, and 3 years later, in 1975, they still had not identified who this unknown was. And his remains were stored there for a number of years. Now, in the mid-'80s, at the behest of President Ronald Reagan, there was a spearhead to show respect and give Vietnam veterans the welcome home that they never got. So in 1984, the Vietnam Wall was dedicated here in DC, and shortly after that, Congress passed a public resolution to place that unknown from Vietnam here at Arlington, instead of in the laboratory in Pearl Harbor. So he was escorted from Pearl Harbor to Andrews Air Force Base. When he arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, he was taken to the Capitol Rotunda. He lied in state for 2 days, and then on Memorial Day of 1984, he was brought above our heads to the amphitheater. So in the amphitheater, President Ronald Reagan stood in as a symbolic next of kin for that unknown from Vietnam. He received the folded flag on that soldier's behalf, and then the unknown was placed here in Arlington with the other unknowns. The plaza remained like that for a number of years, all the way until 1998. In the early 1990s, there was a woman, her name was Patricia Blassie. She approached her local congressman, and she said that, "I think the Vietnam unknown is my brother." And of course, when somebody approaches a congressman and says that the unknown is my brother, they need some more information than that, and they can't just take that at face value. So they continued to try to identify and do some more background investigating and see how this unknown would be related to her. Now, privately, she hired private investigators and gathered witness testimonies over almost about a decade time period, where she was interviewing people on the ground that were fighting on the ground when her brother was flying over them. She gathered flight logs. She gathered the date that her brother went missing in action, what type of aircraft he was flying, where he was flying. They gathered all this evidence and presented it to Congress in 1998. In 1998, Congress finally agreed that there was enough evidence to disinter the Vietnam unknown and test his DNA against her DNA. So on May 14th, 1998, they disinterred the Vietnam unknown, and then they took him to Walter Reed for DNA testing. They tested DNA from his hip bone against Patricia Blassie's DNA, and it came back as a positive match. So the Vietnam unknown, he was identified as First Lieutenant Michael Blassie of the U.S. Air Force. Due to his family's request, he was officially removed from Arlington, and he was taken to the closest national cemetery to where his family was from, where he grew up, which would be Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. So his grave is now in Jefferson Barracks Cemetery in Missouri, and the Vietnam crypt today is empty. In 1999, a year after this happened, the crypt was rededicated to all those who are missing in action and prisoners of war that are still out there from the Vietnam War. So although it's empty, it's symbolic of all those who are still missing and still out there from Vietnam. That's pretty much where the crypt and the tomb lies today. So although there's 4 places for burial out there, there's only 3 sets of remains that we have. The plaza will basically remain like that forever. There's no way to test the other unknown's DNA because DNA was not available back then. It was, again, very recently that DNA began getting as good as it is, and we'll never have another unknown again because, as you all know, when you went to your AG battalion, they took like 15 vials of blood, and they have a DNA sample from all of us housed in a DNA warehouse. So if any of us are killed in action and we're unidentifiable, they would test that DNA against that massive pool that the DoD has, and will be identified through DNA. So yeah, there will never be another unknown again, which is good news for all of us. Any questions about any of the history part that I just covered? I know I just threw a lot of information at you guys.